Hello, all. This is Dr. Dave Maslach talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3. And in this particular video, I want to talk about how do you actually write a hypothesis. So if you don't know me, I'm a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship. And I created this whole reciprocity project to give back as much as I possibly can. There were so many people that helped me out to get through graduate school that I decided to pay the favor forward and help you out. So I'm doing these YouTube videos. I also created this sort of sharing economy proofreading app. That's a work in progress. Still working on it. But anyways, so this is a really important question that we're all stuck with. And I'm learning in terms of how to actually construct a better hypothesis. And I've been learning about this for the last 15 years. It takes a lot of work, a lot of effort to create and craft a really good hypothesis. So if you don't know, that this video is probably going to be especially relevant for people that are doing a PhD or going through graduate school in some sort of social science, like business administration or something like that, because it is specific to that particular context. And I wanted to point that out. So the first thing is when you are constructing a hypothesis, and some of this, I just don't know where your knowledge level is. So I want to be clear about this kind of stuff. So you need to have some sort of general theory about how the world actually works and the thing that you're actually looking at. And it doesn't really matter what kind of theory that you're using. So for example, you can use, maybe it's a religious theory, for example, of how the world actually works. You can use some sort of scientific theory about maybe it's the molecules or elements or something that's moving around. Maybe it's use one of the sort of theories that we would use. Maybe it's transaction cost economics, or maybe it's sort of general equilibrium theory or something that's sort of basic in terms of how the world works. And we all have these sort of different, they're almost screens or waves that you see the world. And you kind of have to pick which one you're going to use before you actually take a dive into a hypothesis. That's important to sort of think about in terms of what theory you're going to use. And the reason why you do that is the entire paper that you're writing is going to be framed within that particular theory. It sort of helps you with thinking through how you're actually going to write up the particular idea and sort of come up with different solutions and, different mechanisms and things like that. So once you have this general theory, then you kind of want to create a hypothesis that is looking to sort of disprove or falsify that particular theory. And you want to look at that. So there's kind of two ways that you can look at this. And they're both equally fine as far as I'm concerned. And maybe other people have different views and stuff. So one way is you look at the theory first, you read the theory, then you try to think of a context that would try to falsify, disprove that particular theory as much as you can, right? So that might be going and looking at, so I'm not exactly sure at this moment in terms of, so it might be looking at, so for example, you're looking at equilibrium and looking at how the economy is in equilibrium. Well, then you want to look for settings where you might not find that sort of equilibrium sort of viewpoint, right? You might want to look at where there's constantly a lot of change, there's lots of turbulence within the economic environment, something like that. The other thing that you can look for is you kind of go a little bit backwards, and it's more almost induction. I know that's not really hypothesis testing, but you kind of have to be a little bit practical with some of this stuff, in the sense that you're using the theory, but a lot of us, so especially in business and, especially if you are doing a social science, you have a context that you're kind of really interested in anyways. And so you are thinking about this particular context and you're thinking about the theory, and often you will come across a sort of interesting insight. Maybe it's a manager, maybe it is a company, maybe it is, maybe you read a newspaper article where they come up with some really interesting thing and you're like, that doesn't really fit with the theory very well, or that just doesn't sort of jive with what the theory that I understand how it actually works. Right, so that's what's really important. So if you're doing a PhD, really important to do all that coursework and before your comprehensive exams. That's why people do that kind of stuff. is because you're just getting a bunch of theories jammed in your head. And then once you go and read a newspaper nobody reads newspapers these days. Once you go and read, the Financial Times or something like that online, you go and look and you find something that's really interesting. And you're like, I wouldn't have thought that would have happened in that particular way. Or you have an interview with a manager and they're like talking about something. And you're like, well, that's really weird because, I know in transaction cost economics, they talk about it in this way, but then you're saying it in this way. And we're like, well, that's really weird. Or maybe you're looking at some place in Africa and they're doing something completely different, how we understand how, the world generally works. And so once you have that sort of moment where there is some weird thing, right? So it's kind of like, it's like you're wandering around and then all of us have this idea that gravity works, right? So it pulls us towards the center of the earth. Well, then if you stumble across something that is floating in midair, you'd be like, that's really weird. I don't know why that's happening. We got to figure that out, right? So it turns out maybe if something is sort of floating, it might be on water, right? And then you can come up with we could figure out about different densities of fluids, right? So air is if you didn't know this, air is a fluid, or you can model it as a fluid. You can model water as a fluid as well, right? And so they have different densities. And so things are going to float on top of the water. It's not going to float in the air. If we were light enough, we would float in the air as well, right? So, but anyways, I digress with that. But basically, that's what you're trying to look for, right? Is that particular moment where it's kind of unusual. And then once you have that sort of unusual moment, you can craft a set of theories that fits within that sort of general theories, or, a more specific theory that fits within that general theory of how that could disprove or falsify that particular, portion of that general theory, right? So if you didn't know, that's kind of how it works, right? So you have this sort of general theory of how the world works, but then there are certain elements or certain assumptions of the general theory that you can sort of pick apart. And, eventually, if there is enough people that have picked apart one particular theory and it sort of it's just kind of really, really picked apart, then that nobody really draws upon that knowledge anymore. And it's still there, and we sort of still think about that kind of general theory of how the world works, but it's just not kind of, it just kind of goes out of fashion is more of it, right? So, the old theory that the space was made out of, I think it was ethereal or something like that, right? That space was made out of ether. That's right. Space was made out of ether, kind of grew. It just goes out of fashion because it just, it doesn't make sense after a while. We have enough evidence to show that that's not true, right? It's just a vacuum out there. So, it just kind of, with enough evidence that people are sort of pulling up these moments of where the theory just doesn't work, then people just don't draw upon that. So that's what you're trying to look for, is sort of moments where it doesn't work, as that one sort of component of the theory doesn't work as much as it should. And so that's how you actually come up with the idea for a hypothesis. That's an important thing. And then what you're trying to look for when you craft a hypothesis is, looking at, if you vary one particular thing, it should affect something else over here, right? So if you vary A, it should affect something over here, B. And if it doesn't hold, then we know that hypothesis, that you can't, if it doesn't hold, then you're trying to rule out that particular thing. So basically what you're trying to do, that's a little bit long-winded. So what you're trying to do is come up with a story according to the theory of how the world works, the theory that you have, that you're going to come up with, okay, if you vary A, if A varies, then B is going to vary from that. And if you can't show that, if that's difficult to show, then you're like, this doesn't quite hold. There's no supporting evidence for this based on the theory, right? And so that's what you're trying to do is, craft a story. And it's all science, as much as we would love for it to be really cut and dry, but there is a lot of story crafting behind it. And you're trying to craft a story behind the theory to come up with, okay, this makes a lot of sense that if A varies, then B is going to vary, right? So, a classic example of that, we craft a story about, heat and, the weather outside. On hot days, right? So on very hot days, ice cream consumption is going to go up, and it's just because we really, people want to cool themselves off, right? So that's a general theory that you'd want to look at, right? So on very, very hot days, ice cream consumption is going to go up, and so you want to look at that kind of variance, right? And so if a on hotter days, A goes up, the temperature of the day goes up, then ice cream consumption goes up as well. And that's really what you're trying to look at, is that sort of basic relationship. And if it doesn't, right, so if it goes that, okay, on hotter days, ice cream consumption goes down, you're like, yeah, you know what, those are not relating, or maybe they're inversely related. Or, in what really should happen is if ice cream goes up, there should be absolutely no relationship on over here on hot days. If ice cream consumption doesn't sort of change, or if there is no effect at all, then we can sort of say that, yeah, you know what, there's no relationship there. Our theory is not holding about how the world works, that ice cream consumption is not related to the temperature or the weather. And that's really what you're trying to look at. And what you're trying to do too is, part of this theory construction that you're having, and it's important to sort of think about the theory that you're constructing. You often want to have, it depends on how much writing you want to do, but you want to have maybe 2 or 3 different sort of mechanisms, or a single mechanism that shows how this might work. So a mechanism is the relationship or the explanation of why something happens. Right. So it might be that, ice cream consumption makes you hot or temperature makes you hot inside. And then because of that, you start craving things to cool you down. Right. So in general, the general mechanism in human beings is that we want to cool ourselves down. And ice cream is one way we can cool ourselves down. We have a tendency towards sweet goods or sweet things because we're human beings and we crave, sugar, fat, and salt, and things like that, right? So then we're going to consume more, and we're going to want to have more ice cream, and so we're going to consume more of that. And so you might come up with, maybe it's different perspectives on that. So one of them might be sort of the general metabolic way that we might consume, or the way that we might think about food as like a utility, and ice cream as a utility to cool us down. But it also there might be some sort of cultural effects as well, right? So that might be another paragraph, or set of mechanisms that you might talk about as the cultural effect of it, right? So in other places, maybe in Egypt, for example, or in Antarctica, ice cream consumption is not going to be a big thing, right? It doesn't really matter in those particular places because it's not cultural. It doesn't make sense with that. And there also might be, maybe it is related to people's taste buds, for example. We all might have different kinds of taste buds and sort of different ways that we're tasting things and sweetness. So some people, or some group of people, might want sweetness more than others. And so in that subgroup of people, so this might be another sort of mechanism that you could look at, right? So this subgroup of people, they're going to crave more ice cream on hotter days because they really like sweet things, right? And that is, completely fine to look at. And that's how you actually build a set of hypotheses, if you didn't know that. So you kind of have a general hypothesis of how the world works in what you're saying. And you have 2 or 3 different mechanisms to explain what's going on. And then as you start building out the theory, then you actually start thinking about the different sort of areas where it might hold or might not hold, right? So for example, in the subgroup, it might be that the subgroup actually has, greater propensity to really like sugar. And so they're going to like the, ice cream consumption more. So you might want to look at that subgroup and do a hypothesis specifically to that particular subgroup of the population, or of the sample that you're looking at. And so that's really how you're looking for crafting these different hypotheses. And generally you have 2 or 3 different points, maybe more, of in each point, if you didn't know that, it's a paragraph that you'd want to write, maybe even 2 paragraphs, right? And as you're doing that, you also want to think about how the reviewer or the author or other people are going to critique what you're going to do and what you're going to say. And so sometimes you might phrase things as like, some people might think it's this, but then, according to these conditions, we think it's that. And that's a great way to get around that response. So you're you're telling people like, oh, it's obvious that it's going to be this, but however, it could also be this given the conditions that we have, right? So that's what you're trying to do, is sort of anticipate what people are going to think about when you're crafting these hypotheses. So it gets them to the point of like, oh, they're thinking the same way that you're thinking. And when you get to that hypothesis, and then the hypothesis itself is usually really straightforward, and it's hard to make something that's straightforward if you didn't know that. Something that's simple is hard to write. And everybody goes through this, and don't be afraid. What you're trying to do with the hypothesis is just making it very simple that if A goes down and then B goes up, or if A goes up, B goes up, just really simple stuff. And you're looking at the sort of construct of how that actually might work. And you can watch some of my older videos or other stuff where we talk about sort of empirical measures of the construct, but you're just looking at the sort of general construct of, trying to change that particular construct that you're trying to do. Oh, and one other thing that's really important is to define your constructs in your hypothesis construction as well. And so you might do that at the beginning, where you define the different constructs that you're looking at. And I could get into that if you want, but I'm not going to in this video. So that's really what you're looking at. And sometimes you might even put in boundary conditions in the hypothesis construction, that you're thinking about what are the particular boundary conditions under this might hold or might not hold. And that's where you can bring in some of the setting that you're looking at, right? So if you're a PhD, and you're thinking of doing this sort of PhD route in business, then you want to think about the setting. It's really important often. So some people might try to be parsimonious and generalize as much as they possibly can across many different settings. However, I find personally that it makes more sense to bring in sort of contextual stuff, but in a theoretical way. It's really hard to think about that. What you're trying to do is bring in some contextual stuff, not sort of specifically talking about the context, but things that matter to the particular context, right? So it might be, in terms of the ice cream example, if it's cultural, then how embedded somebody is within a society or within the particular culture is going to make a big difference in what the outcomes are, right? So you'd have to maybe talk about that, or think about how embedded they are into the particular culture and enculturated within the society, right? So some people might, if you're looking at people that are that just moved into a country, for example, they're immigrants, for example, they might not be enculturated into the sort of ice cream culture that they might have in a particular country, right? And that's totally fine. And that's not a political statement in any sort of way. I want to point that out, but you just have to think about that. It's like, okay, some people are going to vary in different ways, and you can bring in those boundary conditions and weave them in to the theoretical construction for the hypothesis. And then eventually you will get, after a couple of pages, it's usually after a couple of pages, you don't want any longer than that, people get bored. And then you can run into problems that way. And boredom is a big thing that you have to worry about. Trust me, reviewers are going to get bored. The people that are reading it are going to get bored. So you want to make sure that it's not boring. And so what you want to do is, like these videos, right? You're probably already bored. So what you want to do is make sure that you just get the basics, a very simple hypothesis, A leads to B somehow, and then craft the mechanisms of getting to that particular explanation, or getting to why that actually might happen. All right, so hopefully, and then once you do that, you're going to have to iterate a couple of times, right? So a lot of times, actually, if you didn't know this, you have to make it simpler, make it easier. It's not going to be, the first time you do it, it's not going to be the best. And you have to make it simpler. You have to keep doing what you're doing and making it simpler and simpler until it's really painfully obvious, until the fact that people are like almost, yeah, so what? And that's actually a good thing at that moment, because it's so painfully clear people can understand it. All right, so if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. I do appreciate it. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's amazing that you are following along this far. All right, take care. Have a wonderful day. Bye.